Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Kenneth B. King, a New York-based couturier who specializes in evening wear. He was born and raised in Salinas, Kansas, eventually moving to Oklahoma when he was 10 years old. He earned a BS in fashion merchandising from Central State University in Edmond, Oklahoma, and learned pattern making in San Francisco from Paris-trained Simone Cessna. Kenneth has sold to boutiques across the country, such as Maxfield, Wilkes Bashford, and Ultimo. His work has appeared in music videos and TV commercials, and he's designed for Geena Davis, Cloris Leachman, Taupin, and Elton John, who has a substantial collection of his work. He's also been featured on the red carpet for the Oscars, and his creations are in the permanent collections of the De Young Museum in San Francisco, the LA County Museum of Art, the Oakland Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He's an adjunct assistant professor at the Fashion Institute of New York and teaches around the United States and online. He's a contributing editor and author to Threads magazine, has courses on Craftsy and Burda, and has written many books on couture sewing techniques. Kenneth currently lives in New York with his husband, Andrew Marley. Hi, Kenneth, and welcome to So-and-So.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You and I have talked before we had this conversation. I've done some research, and we have got some wonderful conversation and questions ahead of us. So I'm going to jump right in. You were born and raised in Salinas, Kansas, and eventually moved to Oklahoma. And your childhood had a major impact on who you are and what you do. Would you tell us about your early years?
Well, I was, like you said, I was born in Salinas, Kansas. My dad died when I was 10, and that, having him disappear was a big deal. He was an electrical engineer, and when I was growing up, he was very big about letting me work with my hands. And he would bring home like old alarm clocks and gears from work. He would encourage me to take them apart so I could see how things worked. So it gave me sort of an engineering turn of mind.
Mm-hmm.
When he died, my mother, of course, was just scared to death that her son would turn into a sissy, which kind of happened. So she was, she did the best she could. She had, 3 kids to raise in a small town, and she did the best she could. So we, during that time, and actually even before that, I started making things. I started sewing when I was 4. I started with embroidery. My grandma was the person who really encouraged me a lot, even though my mother sort of kind of cringed whenever that happened. I started making doll clothes. And eventually, in my teen years, I started making clothing for myself. My mother remarried when I was 13. We ended up in Oklahoma City. And it's its own story that I could fill an entire podcast with.
Mm-hmm.
But moving to Oklahoma was traumatic in that it was the first time I ever heard the word and when I heard it, I knew it was bad. I didn't know what it meant,
Mm-hmm.
but I just knew that I was other. So what helped me to deal with really all of the those things in my life was making things and disappearing kind of into this story world with my dolls. I had a dollhouse that I made. And years later, my mother had a lawyer named Harry. Harry, in my mind, was George Burns. He looked like the comedian George Burns.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one who sat me down. And it was kind of fascinating when I think back on it. I was about 15. My mother had divorced the second husband by this time, and he was her lawyer. He called me in his office and he said, I've been watching you. And you have a certain something in your eyes. So I feel I need to have some conversations with you. And then he said, I know it sucks for you right now. I know what you're going through. But this is not forever. You just need to keep out of trouble and get good grades. And one day you can leave all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So having the combination of sort of the voice of reason, because he talked me through a lot of adult type topics, and making things, it saved me. I had a therapist years later who said, statistically, given your background, you should have either abused alcohol, abused drugs, or attempted suicide. And so statistically, that was not, anything you did. And he kind of marveled that it happened. And looking back on it, I realized that it was, Harry helping me out, giving me advice, but living in my mind, living in my creativity. And
Mm-hmm.
later on, the story part of the creativity dawned on me during the COVID, because, we were all locked down. We had to stay in. We were, it was dangerous to go outside. So I post stories of kind of these doll stories on Instagram. So it occurred to me that I would start this story, Crazy Bella and the Blackmail Attempt. And I had several people call me and ask me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "This is how I'm getting through this." So,
Good that they checked on you. That's good.
Yeah. So, but the thing that really was interesting and kind of an epiphany about it is that is how I have survived, is by making things and creating
Mm-hmm.
stories in my head. So that's a little bit about my childhood.
So let me ask you, there are many outlets you could have used to make things. Why did you choose sewing? What drew you to that?
Well, in my day, everyone's mother sewed, because at the time, ready to wear was very expensive. So my mother had two daughters. She would not sew for me because she said men's clothes were too hard. She had two daughters, so she was always sewing. And I traded my gun and holster set to my sister for her Barbie so I could have a Barbie.
That was a good trade,
It
right?
was. I agree. I still have her to this day. Her name was Estelle. She was 27, because I never bought the teenage fashion model story, because the Barbie clothes were grown-up lady clothes. So Estelle lived in a big city. She had a convertible. She went to the theater, the opera, and restaurants, and she always wore evening clothes. So all the scraps that were in the wastebasket were fair game. So, in the early days, I had a needle and thread and my scissors and the scraps. That's what really got me to sewing.
Estelle was important to you. Your grandmother, and you mentioned her, she supported who you were. She was a champion for who you were and who you wanted to be. Tell us more about her.
She was I want to say simple peasant woman. I know that sounds terrible, but her family was from Eastern Europe. They made their immigration to the United States around the turn of the 20th century. She was a farm girl. She was an orphan. Her mother died when she was 3. Her most vivid memory was because her father was a drunk, and the doctor gave him the money to go to the pharmacist to get the drugs to save the mother, but he stopped by a saloon and drank up the money. So her mother died. Her most vivid memory of her childhood was at age 3, sitting in the living room with the body, watching the candles so they wouldn't burn the house down.
Oh my.
So, she had her issues. I wouldn't say she necessarily celebrated what I was doing, but she encouraged it, because if nothing else, she said to my mother, "You don't have to worry about him on rainy days. He's not going to be, ding-donging at you for, I'm bored. I want to go outside." So, it was okay. She taught me embroidery. She taught me crochet. She taught me knitting.
Hmm.
And it kind of created a bug in me. And I thought my mother liked sewing because she did it, but it was years later when I discovered that, she said to me, I hated it. But by that time I was hooked.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, so grandma liked it. She was always working on something. In the winter, there was always a quilt frame set up. In the summer, she had crochet so she could sit outside. She was always making something. And I was surrounded by people who always made things. My mother crocheted, she knitted, she did upholstery. My dad had a wood shop. So seeing my parents and all those around me making things, it was just what you did.
So you've mentioned several people who have been influential. Your mom, your dad, your grandmother, Estelle, your 27-year-old Estelle. There was Harry. And then there was Norma. Who is Norma, and how did she influence you?
Well, Norma, it's a little bit of a story, so I hope we have time. I met Norma in 1983. I lived in San Francisco. I wanted to buy myself a psychic reading for my birthday. So there was this metaphysical church and bookstore in San Francisco called Amron Metaphysical Center. I got a reading with Norma, and I had had readings before where it just felt like a fake. But when I went in and sat down, she looked at me and said, I see a lot of color coming from your hands. It's like you know about color, but you're studying, you need to know more. And at that time, I was taking a course in color theory at City College.
Mm.
So then she looked at me and she said, so now can we kind of get rid of the skepticism and get busy? So Norma she was another mother, like my friend Susan I mentioned earlier. And she was another mother. She was my metaphysical mother. She was the one who said to me that I was going to be taking what I knew, because I worked in window display. I was going to be taking what I knew in my career and changing that career. And she gave me a timeline. She said, next year you're going to be figuring out what you're going to do. When it comes time to, by 86, you're going to be off and running. And then you're going to be able to quit your regular job. So over the years, she was another Harry too. She also talked about metaphysical things and how all of that works. So she helped me establish my belief system in that the Church of Amron. She always said, we do not proselytize. People come to our church because they see something of value. You don't try to convert people. And she said, you never believe anything that you don't have direct experience of. And then through our friendship, I had some very powerful direct experiences that have affected my belief system. So she was a cheerleader. She was a mentor. She was a parent. She was a great friend. When you think of spiritual people, you think they sit and they meditate and they sing holy, holy, holy. But we could go out to dinner and, the conversations would range from cute guys to some very powerful metaphysical ideas. It was a very powerful and influential friendship.
And was Norma aware of the influence of her words and where you took your life to, and the impact that she had on you?
I think she did. I believe that we go on after we leave here. I told her many times how grateful I was. So I believe she did. Yeah, she had a tremendous influence on a lot of people. She's cast a long shadow.
It sounds like it. Now, you said that you met Norma when you were in San Francisco, and when you lived there, your work, as you've described it, you were deeply influenced by the Beaux Arts architecture of San Francisco's civic buildings. Talk to us about that.
Well, around, like the late 1800s, early 1900s into probably the 30s, some people say, oh, the Gilded Age was all a bad thing, but there were good things about it. And I see this also in New York, the idea that public structures like City Hall, for example, in San Francisco, could be splendid, so that when you, as just a regular citizen, went into City Hall, you went into this building that was visually rich to look at. It was available for everyone to see. Not saying that that era was all great, but from the standpoint of architecture, what I love most about the Beaux Arts style and a lot of architecture in the turn of the 20th century is just the richness of ornament, the idea that even humble buildings like houses in San Francisco would have all of this riotous, elaborate, exuberant ornament. That's something that really appealed to me.
I like the word riotous. That conjures up such a vision of what you saw and has translated to your work. So I want to take this a step further. I'm going to quote you here. And you have said, and I quote, "There is a prevailing attitude today that to be avant garde, one has to produce clothing that is ugly, shockingly sexual, or otherwise uncomfortable to look at. Beauty is now relative, a standard that is always being redefined. Creating classically beautiful garments is regarded in some circles as quaint and old fashioned. I disagree." End quote. Unpack that for us. Tell us what you mean here.
Okay. Well, starting off, Christian Dior used to say that he wanted to create clothing that gives pleasure, which I think is a good thing. I look at some of the clothing today, and there is this word that I really detest, edgy. To my mind, edgy defines as it's either badly made or badly fitting,
Mm-hmm.
or otherwise just not that pleasurable to look at. So for the kinds of things that I make, I go back to the Beaux Arts architecture and specifically
Mm-hmm.
the Opera House. When I was a young pup in San Francisco, I got a job as an usher at the Opera House, which is across from City Hall. So for 12 years, I got to see whatever was playing. I usually ushered Saturday nights, and the building itself is beautiful. It's really quite spectacular. I got to see all the productions of opera. I got to see ballet. It gave me a taste for visual richness, if I could say that. It also gave me a sense of spectacle. One of the things when the opera house, after the earthquake, the opera house was shut down for like a year and a half for renovations. And I was able to go to the opening night. This was the big ticket when it opened back up. So I got to go to the opening night, which when I think about that evening, to this day, it's thrilling. It was thrilling because how they started the evening, because they kept the lights very low so people couldn't get a good look at the place. Then they put the lights out and they had this crackly recording of opening night in 1934. And you
Mm-hmm.
heard this crackling. You heard Gaetano Marella and the San Francisco Symphony or Opera Orchestra now will play the national anthem. And so you heard this crackly recording,
Mm-hmm.
and then the orchestra blended in, and then they started creeping the lights up. And it was, I mean, I get a little emotional even now. It was that thrilling. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things I remember thinking was, I am part of this. This, this building houses amazing memories. And so when I build clothing, I want something that's going to, that's going to carry, the person is going to carry for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you put on an outfit or you carry a bag or a wrap, you carry all the memories of the good times with you. And it's kind of a long answer to your question, but there's something about that and the power of being able to create something that someone can then invest with their memory. And I have one client who was telling me recently, she's bought a number of my wraps. She said that the daughters are now kind of like, okay, may you live a long and happy life, but who's going to get this and who's going to get that? Because not only they can carry her memories, but then they can create their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a little different than what we're seeing now. Um, and just creating beauty because we don't see as much beauty as we used to back then.
So your creations aren't simply something that people wear to go do a thing. They are part of the experience.
Yes. See, this from a maker standpoint, I think is important. And this is something I tell my students at FIT. I said, you have to remember that someone has to wear this. There is some people call what I do wearable art. I'm not a fan of that because in wearable art, the article is the star. But in couture, the person wearing it is the star. And therefore, it has to, on top of being beautiful, it has to be durable. It has to be easy to live with. So there are engineering things that I have come up with through my career that make a piece easy. So people buy the first piece because it's beautiful, but they come back because they say they're easy to wear.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, that's another part of it.
What are some of the things that you said you've come up with some different techniques to make some things easy to wear? Can you share some of those with us?
Well, one short one, there's a particular boa that I make, and it wears front to back. You have the ends hanging over your shoulders to the back, and there are tassels on the end. The boa itself is not just a straight piece. It's shaped somewhat like a boomerang. And then on the edges of the piece that hit the shoulder, there's a prominent bone in the shoulder. The garment is eased down onto the edge just slightly so that when you
Uh,
put it on and you center it, that particular part of that edge cups over and grabs the shoulder. So you're not always fussing with it. You're not always trying to keep it centered. It will center on its own so that when
mm-hmm.
you put it on, it automatically does that. And then you go. Other things are like hidden pockets because you always need a pocket. So these are
Indeed.
things that you have to think about so that the person wearing the piece doesn't have to fuss with the piece.
They can blend with it instead of fussing with it.
Yes.
Let me ask you, what took you to San Francisco?
Well, another long story, but anyone who knows me knows the stories are long. I was working in window display in Oklahoma City at a place called Dillard's.
Sure.
So I got the promotion to the new store in Quail Springs. This is 1980. So they hired another guy named Mark. Now, Mark had lived with his partner in Boston. Then they ended up in San Francisco through a chain of circumstances. They ended up in Oklahoma City. So he applied for this job. That's how I met him. So he was eventually made the display manager. And then he up and moved about 6 months later to Austin, Texas, then back to San Francisco. So when he sent me the note saying, I'm back in San Francisco, here's my phone number, I called him and said, I want to come visit. He said, well, if you come visit, bring your portfolio because I may have a job for you. So I went. This was in July of 81. I went I went to San Francisco, I applied for the job and got it. So by end of August of 81, I was in San Francisco. So I went with career.
And that was quite a move. Different culture, different vibes. Um, but so much happened to you there. Now I want to go back to another person who influenced you, and that is Mariano Fortuny. Talk about his work and how he influenced your work.
Well, I came to know Mariano Fortuny. In college, we did a study tour in New York City. So we went to the Costume Institute at the Met. They have a substantial collection of his work. And later I learned that they were the kind of the backdrop for Fortuny's stencil textiles. But it created this love of that particular rarefied aesthetic that is Fortuny. And, people who don't know them, don't know Fortuny, it's okay. It's kind of one of those kind of under the radar tastes. They still make the fabrics to this day, printed in by the same techniques as he used back in the day in their fabrics. So throughout the years, I have used references to Fortuny like the pleats. I've also actually gotten to use the fabrics themselves.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's part of that whole turn of the 20th century thing that was going on.
There's a definite theme from what you learned and what you create now. I want to talk about when Swarovski wanted to explore the potential of home furnishings. They commissioned you to create a fantasy chair slipcover,
Yes.
and it's included in their publication Design Expressions from Brazil and Russia.
Mhm.
Tell us about this.
Well, that was, I was a little bit surprised that they contacted me, but at the same time, I had actually contacted them when I did the bead embroidery book some years ago. They had seen my work on my website. So the fun part about that, they said, because I like doing upholstered furniture, but this was a slipcover, which was a
Mhm.
little different for me. And they do this to when they introduce a new line of things. So they sent me this order form and said, well, what do you need? And there was this part of me that was like, let's see what I can get away with here. And because, hey, I mean, they're saying we're going to send it. And so I just thought, okay, I'm going to just ask for what I want and we'll see what I get. And then I can work with that. So I asked for what I wanted in the quantities that I asked for. And about a month later, this like 30 pounds of Swarovski arrived. And I giggled like a little girl when I was opening all these boxes. I was talking to a friend on the phone and she said, you sound like a little girl. I said, because it's all so pretty. So yeah, it was just, it was one of those fantasy things that I did. One of the things in creating, it seems like I do what I kind of am intrigued by. And then later on, people catch up and they say, I want one of those. So the first home furnishings thing I did was a footstool, which actually Elton John owns. And it was because I had a friend who wrote for an interiors magazine in the Bay Area. And she said, I love your work, but you don't do home furnishings. If you did home furnishings, I would put you in the magazine. I said, well, I just happen to be working on a footstool. So I went home and I started a footstool. So that's kind of how that started. But, it's interesting to see that it's like when the things that kind of catch my interest then turn into something else.
How did Elton John get a hold of your footstool?
Well, in 86, I was making hats primarily. Now the hats, and this is back to a Fortuny influence. I understood that you can have a fantastic product with a crummy package and you've got a crummy product. But if you have a fantastic product with a fantastic package, you've really got something. So all the hats, all the accessory pieces were housed in black velvet boxes, lined in black taffeta. And there was black tissue paper that wrapped everything. If it was a hat, there was a hat shape underneath the taffeta with big, large pearl-headed hat pins to hold it in. So it was this whole kind of like a tea ceremony. When you open, there was the sigh when you opened the lid and the crackle of the tissue paper when you took the tissue paper out, and then you pulled the little hat pins out and pulled out the hat. So I started doing these vests because men's evening wear at the time, I thought, God, this is kind of boring. I think it would be kind of fun to see what I can do with the vest. So I did this evening vest and it was embellished. It had sterling silver buttons and hardware because I was taking a class at City College. And so I had an agent I was working with in Los Angeles. She took everything to Maxfield. It was 2 days before Thanksgiving in 86. And what I learned was that the owner of the store didn't get it. The buyers didn't understand it. They called the main sales lady, who is a woman named Mindy. Mindy came in and she said, oh, I can sell this. And she got out her little black book, and between 7 in the evening and 10:30 the next morning, everything they bought from me was out the door. So they were on the phone saying, hey, does he have anything else he has? So what I had been doing for 3 years, because I back to Norma's like, you got to be ready. Just keep creating this stuff. And I was making all these hats and all my friends were saying, isn't it kind of embarrassing that he's, has this little hobby with hats. He thinks he's going to be a designer. Well, I'm like, no, this is called inventory. And so, the vest was kind of part of that. So, that sold, and they called and said, hey, can we have more of those? So it started a whole series. So this was in March of 80s. Well, it was somewhere in early 87 that he started buying the vests at Maxfield and then the hats. And Mindy thinks that he has probably well over 100 pieces.
Oh my.
There's a part of me that I didn't think I'd made 100 pieces, but apparently I had. And he has a lot. He has the good stuff.
Yeah.
Because the order would come 4 hats, 2 weeks, blank check.
Interesting.
And so every time I'd get another order, I would have to say to myself, okay, how can I outdo what I just did? So when I was delivering the hat to the Victoria and Albert Museum some years ago, the curator asked, who has the good stuff? I said, he has the good stuff. If you really want, he has the good stuff.
And you can see some of the good stuff. There is on your website, there's the music video for Sacrifice. There is the Diet Coke commercial. And you can't, we've all seen these so many times. We just didn't know you were a part of it. So for those sharing our conversation today, do go to Kenneth's website because you can see his creations in action with Elton John.
Also, there's a video called You Gotta Love Someone. That's one of mine. That's a white hat. And then there was the video for the song Club at the End of the Street where they animated, it was an animation. They animated the hat and the vest. So, you know, and actually, I remember at the time, I had an assistant named Shelley. Shelley saw on Saturday Night Live, they did something with Elton John. And if I could get my hands on it, I would. And they did a parody of one of those hats. So it kind of got, it was kind of fascinating that it got into the bigger culture.
So I would invite anyone who is sharing this conversation, if you know how to help Kenneth get his hands on that,
please.
At the end of our conversation, we'll tell you how you can keep in touch with him. But keep your eyes out for that. So you are a part of pop culture, as it probably not intending to be, but here you are. And you have been in music videos, commercials. You have been on the red carpet for the Oscars. Tell us about, you were talking about Elton John's hats and things. Tell us about some of the other creations you made, and maybe talk about who wore them and how this came to be.
Well, you know, a lot of it came through the store in Los Angeles. This is back in the days when famous people actually paid for their clothing. You know, because I had people say to this day, oh, you should be on the red carpet. Well, I was when people actually bought their clothing. So, you know, that like Geena Davis, Don Johnson, Cloris Leachman, may she rest in peace. It's kind of a long list of people. And I don't have all the photos of red carpets, but it was nice to know that I was on the red carpet when they actually bought the piece.
How does it work now? Are they given the items to wear them and then give exposure to the designers? Is it more of an influencer mentality now?
Well, my understanding, the times I've been approached, it was like, not only do you give them the clothing, you pay them. And, you know, and so, okay, if that's how it works, that's how it works. I'm not interested in doing that.
Well, you don't need to. Certainly people know who you are. I have a question, and this is a personal curiosity for me. You were talking about your evening embellished vests. We're going to talk about those in a minute. But there is a brooch, Kenneth, that you created in 1987, but you did not wear it until your wedding day in January of 2016. And I read this fact, and I thought, you know, this is interesting. Why is this piece special? And why did it take you so long to wear it?
1987, just a little kind of back up a little bit. Late 86, I was still working in window display. And the business was starting to take off. And in March of 87, I quit my job. So I was off and running, but I didn't have any kind of savings because I was young and foolish. I always refer to him as my trophy husband, but they get expensive after a while. So the trophy husband, in the middle of 87, the summer of 87, he had his son visiting. And I was working on this big order. I was working like 18-hour days to get this big order out. And this orchid brooch was one of the pieces I was making for this order. Now, this is hammered bronze and sterling. It was an extremely complex piece. There were, I think, 27 solder joints on it. It was really, really a challenge to get this thing to hold together. So got all the solder joints done. I was like, great. Now I can start on doing the patina and the finishing. And he came to the studio with his son asking for more money. And he always handled my work like a 6-year-old. And he knocked it out of my hand and it hit and I can still to this moment hear that crack when it hit the concrete floor. And 3 solder joints popped loose. And this is the only time in my life I've ever been so angry that the only thing I could think of to do was just jump up and down. And I looked at him and I said, I think you need to go. And he started pushing back. And his son, who was like, 14 at the time, and his son said, Dad, I think we need to go. And I remember pushing him out the door and slamming the door and leaning my back against the door and looking up to the heavens and saying, I want this man out of my life. And 3 months later, I got my wish. So that was in 1987. Well, I was single for oh God, 25 years before I met my husband, because I, years before, I dated a guy in Oklahoma City named Daryl. Now, Daryl was kind and he was decent. And when I was 22, what did I know?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that guys like that came along like as regularly as subway trains, but I learned that they come along once every 30 years. So Daryl, when the question, when I was moving to San Francisco, what's going to happen here? And he said to me, you have to go because if you stayed, you grow to hate me.
Mm.
Now that's love. I have to say that's love.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when I gave the trophy husband the heave ho, I just kind of said, the next one, the one I'm going to settle down with is going to be another Daryl when I
Mm-hmm.
see that. So in 2011, it was November 4th, 2011. I was at this event at Penn & Fletcher, which is an embroidery house in New York. And I was wearing a pair of Fortuny jeans because I had gotten this big chunk of Fortuny fabric. And I thought, hey, I want to make some jeans out of this $400 a yard wholesale fabric. So I figured Penn & Fletcher he was having a luncheon for a visiting dignitary from London. And so I thought, okay, free food and embroidery that sounds like my kind of thing. So I
Mm-hmm.
wore my new Fortuny jeans and I had on my cashmere turtleneck and on this great jacket. I looked good that day. So I got out of the elevator walked into the showroom, and this rather nice looking man walked over to me and said, "Is that real Fortuny?" And I turned and looked at him and said, "Why, as a matter of fact, it is. Who are you?" And that was my husband's opening line. So we dated and we eventually, it was 2016, January 9th. And so I was coming up with my wedding outfit. I wanted to wear something on my lapel, but I didn't want to wear a boutonniere because it's just not. But I had the Orchid Broach and I brought it out of its box because I had never worn it because it was so special. It really is one of the more special pieces that I have made. And I realized I was making the brooch I would wear on my wedding day.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes if you take the long view of history, something like this makes more sense.
Does Andrew work with you now?
Well, his first career was costume design for Broadway and opera. So he did a number of productions for Beverly Sills at the City Opera. He's that kind of good. He segued into interior design and he sells real estate. So we don't necessarily work together, but the doll couture book, I got this idea and I said, honey, would you do fashion sketches of the little outfits for the book?
Mm-hmm.
And he did. So they're not all of them, but some of them are going to be in the book. So we kind of did work together.
So I do want to talk about the book next, but I do want to ask you just a little bit more about your evening embellishment vests. Now,
Okay.
you talked about them a little bit, but these are one of your signature pieces. Talk a little bit more about them for us.
Well, it's based on a kind of a classic men's dinner jacket vest. So it's a front, it has an elastic at the waist, the hardware that attaches. It also adjusts at the neck. So it was a series that I called it a series. I used the same pattern for every one of the vests. Each one of the vests was different. So over the years, it kind of forced me actually to look at different combinations of fabrics and textures and beads and so forth. The embellishment style was really born with the vest and the hat because I couldn't see to make mirror images match. I've got something kind of dyslexic going on. And I realized that if you use what I call trim, yardage trim, in the industry is called braid, to lay down basically a skeleton on each lapel or each pocket, then I could make mirror images appear to match. So then there were two questions I had to ask myself. One is, how do you make it look like you didn't just stick down some trim, because that's cheating? And the other thing is, what do you do at the ends? So answering those two questions it was like a thing. Last week, I just taught this at FIT to my students, and they were all kind of amazed at how easy it was. I said, the actual conceptually, it's extremely easy, but there's a lot of bang for the buck, and there's so many different ways you could go with it. So it allowed me a cash cow, so to speak, because each one of them was different. I'm told that the average customer had 6 of them. So, it allowed me to explore different fabrics, different materials, some fabric manipulation techniques. But it was something that was accessible to a lot of people. It was not so fit specific as a garment. And that's really why I started with accessories to begin with, was because you didn't have to deal with the issue of fit.
So now I want to ask the question that we have been alluding to this whole conversation. I'm going to go from your creations to the new book you have coming out. It's called Doll Couture, The Story of Lola. And you and I have talked about this. It's a wonderful story, but I also love the story about how you created the book. So can we start there, and would you walk us through how the book came to be?
Okay. So the book really started in 2019, if I were to really kind of trace it back. In 2019, New York Magazine. I was making Barbie clothes for my husband's niece in Australia, little Charlie. It was determined that she was old enough for Barbie clothes, and, it was determined that I was going to make her some, which I thought, okay, fine. So between the semesters, fall and spring, I started making little Barbie clothes for little Charlie and posting them on Instagram. Then came the email from the fashion editor at New York Magazine with the question, we're doing an article on Barbie as influencer. We love what you're doing. Can you replicate these 4 looks from the collections? Well, 2 of the looks were ugly. I didn't want to do them, but the other 2 were really good. So I said, okay, yes, I would like to do these 2. That's all I have time for. And I want a bushel basket or 2 full of money to do it, thinking they'd say no. And they said, oh, yes. Can you have them by the 15th? And I said, oh, wow. So the doll that I had been using for Charlie's little clothes was a vintage Barbie called the Fashion Queen. She wore wigs. So she became my assistant. Then because I said to them, you have to send me stand-in dolls for the ones that you want these for, because the figures on modern Barbies are different. So they sent me these 2 dolls. And so one was the fit model and one was the intern. And it turned into this story. So there are all of these characters. I think the bodyguard came first. He's this G.I. Joe who wears a blonde wig, because my assistant was stormed in Lincoln Center for her internet fame. So there's this whole cast of characters that kind of played out. Then during the pandemic, Crazy Bella was pinch hitting for another fit model one day at the Kenneth D. King studio. And her high forehead and her kind of kooky hair just kind of struck a chord. One of my Park Avenue gals, who was kind of into PR and so forth, when I posted Crazy Bella the first time, she said, now she's going to be something. She's going to be a thing. So during the pandemic, I did this whole story, the Crazy Bella blackmail story, which I'm actually now posting everything together on Lola the Showgirl 24 in preparation for the book launch. So moving right along, last December, I was having tea with the CEO of Taunton Press. I said, it would be really fun to do like a Crazy Bella story with sewing. You have the little patterns, you have the instructions on how to make it, all of this. And she said, okay. And that was, I was sitting there thinking, okay, is that a yes? And then she said, well, I'll have my people contact you. So yeah, that's how it came about. So the story of Lola, I have a doll named Lola. She has a headdress permanently bolted to her head. You can't remove it. She was a showgirl. And in the Barry Manilow song, at the end of the song, we leave her, she drinks herself half blind. I pick her up from there and I take her forward. So in this story, she ends up in a much better place with some good clothes and some good friends, and the terrible Rico is kind of off her back. So that's the short version. And so it is a sewing book with a story, which is the only time this has ever been done was a book called the Mary Frances Sewing Book in the, I think, 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing like it today. So it's a storybook and a sewing book all in one.
And when can we look forward to that being available?
I'm told end of November.
Okay.
And fingers crossed on that.
Indeed. Kenneth, what's the best decision you ever made?
You know, coming out. I know this sounds very unrelated to everything else, but I just remember in 1980, I can see the moment in my head right now because, I was gay. I was always gay. But I was trying to deny it. I was trying to not be it and trying to pretend I wasn't and wasn't fooling anyone, including myself. And I had this gal just ask me point blank, "Are you gay?" And I understood right then that a fork in the road had occurred. And what I was going to say next was going to affect my path. And I said, yes. So what that did is it threw me off the path of you're going to have a wife and kids and a station wagon and a life of quiet desperation onto a path of the unknown. Because when you take these unconventional paths, the disadvantage, well, I wouldn't say disadvantage. One of the things is you have to chart your own course. So you have to be responsible and you have to make your own decisions and you're responsible for those decisions. The good part is that people who have also taken that path or similar paths are put in your path and you get to interact with a whole different crowd of people. So that decision was the foundation for the other ones. Like, for example, moving from Oklahoma City to San Francisco, starting my own business, moving to New York. The big decisions, there are small ones along the way, but it really was influenced by just saying, this is who I am. And so what I would say to anyone out there, it isn't necessarily gay straight. It's, this is how I am different from others, and I choose to honor that.
Mm-hmm. And when you were asked, the simple word yes changed things for you.
It did.
Kenneth, what's next for you? What's your dream?
Gosh, well, there's the dream and then there's what's next. Well, aside from promoting the book, I'm working on, I can't talk too much about it because it's for the government, but I call it the Spy Clothes Project. And I was approached by someone who, they're all engineers and they're working on these clothes, but they don't know about clothes. So that's kind of the project that I'm looking at now. A dream, I've written a screenplay. And so if you know anyone out there, listeners, who wants to produce a screenplay, I call it All Grown Up Now, Tale of Three Acts. And it is Act 3 of my novel. It's the story of my friendship with my friend Mark, because there was Norma and Mark was the one who got me to California. But there was a whole chapter of my life at like Act 3 of the book where he was in an abusive relationship and I had to kidnap him to get him out. And it turned my life upside down for about 3 years. But so I wrote a screenplay on that. So as far as, big dreams, and hey, dream big because you never know. The universe might say yes. I would like to have that story told in film, a friendship in 3 acts, because there were three distinct periods in our friendship. And there was an event that marked when it changed from period 1 to period 2. And at the end of Act 2, I call it in the book, is when he told me that the other guy had been beating him. And I talked about my mother and what she went through with her second husband. Then he called me a couple of weeks later, basically to complain. And I said, I can't do this anymore. This has lurched from the neurotic to the pathological, and this is where I have to step aside. I will do whatever I can to get you out, but you may not call me until you're ready to leave. 5 years later, at the beginning of Act 3, I got the phone call. And, it's one of those things. I had to I made a promise. And I said, when you're ready to leave, and he was ready to leave. So I understood. And it was a situation, and I'm not exaggerating, really. The other guy had guns. And there was the very real possibility when I went down to snatch him away that I could have got my brains blown out. So I took the proper precautions. I made sure I had good underwear on, as made sure my roots were done so I wouldn't have dark roots. And I rented a spiffy convertible because I figured if I get my brains blown out, I won't have to pay for this. So it kind of goes from there. But that's the kind of the beginning of the screenplay.
So the challenge has been put out there to our so-and-so family. Kenneth's screenplay. Who knows somebody who can help him get this made into reality? And I'd love it if somebody from our so-and-so family actually was able to help you, and you and I talk next and you say, Meg, look what happened. I think that would be awesome.
Well, I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility, because one of the things I've learned in my career is if you tell everyone, someone's going to know someone.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure. Kenneth, we've talked about so many things today. Is there a question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Oh, gosh. Nothing leaps to mind.
Okay. Well, this has been just a wonderful conversation. We've gotten to know you better and learned so much about who you are and what you've created. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
It was my pleasure.
Now, I know our listeners would love to reach out to you. So what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, my website is kennethdking.com. D as in diva. You can email me through there. The Instagram is Kenneth D. King. That's my main Instagram. And then there is Lola the Showgirl 24. That is really going to be dedicated to Lola's story. And like I said earlier, I'm backfilling the Crazy Bella blackmail story because that's going to dovetail with the story of Lola.
Mm-hmm. We're going to look forward to that book, the end of November.
Yes.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing is so much more than a hobby. It has become a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.